Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about Ellis Island. Of course, when we think about Ellis Island, you think about immigrants coming to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century. And one of the key facts that I think we're just going to kick this episode off with, Chris, is that 40% of the citizens of the United States today can trace at least one of their ancestors through Ellis Island. So this is an episode that doesn't deal with some abstract historical fact or place. This is an episode that deals with something that is in the family history of at least 40% of Americans.
Yeah, quick ancestry.com or doing the family tree is going to probably find some connection to Ellis Island, which opens up in 1892 as a federal immigration station, a purpose that it will serve for about 60 years. And you know, Ray, that was the place you came. If you were coming from, and let's be specific, because during this time, you know, in the late 1800s, we had two immigration stations. One was on the East Coast, one was on the west side, Ellis Island being on the east, Angel Island being on the west. And so the way that I would always teach my students to always remember this when it comes to immigration is Ellis Island usually catered to the Europeans, and Angel Island usually catered to the Asian population. And so, you know, a lot of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Great Britain, the Scandinavian countries, basically anywhere from Southern and Eastern Europe, are going to make their way to this immigration station, which is going to give them the opportunity to catch the American dream, as they would like to say. And Ray, this kind of goes back to a previous episode that we did about the Statue of Liberty. For as these individuals will come into the halls of Ellis Island, you know, they will have passed that Statue of Liberty with, you know, the torch showing that here was, you know, an entrance for all individuals to be able to achieve a success and what it is that they're looking for. So Ellis Island has a unique place in American history. I would like to say that it's probably overshadowed some by the Statue of Liberty, you know, that people do not really understand the arduous passage that took place just trying to get into the country.
Yeah, and even once people got into the country, things weren't necessarily easy. I mean, you could go into New York, and I want to talk about this a little later, the conditions that they faced when they went into New York, or people could go out west, or people could go to the south. And of course, if you know anything about American history, you know that a lot of these Europeans who came through Ellis Island, who went places west and south, a lot of them faced discrimination or different forms of discrimination once they got where they were going. Now, the island itself, and Chris, this is one thing that I did not know and found out during the research for this episode. The island itself is, you know, down in the lower part of Manhattan. It was originally about 3 acres large. But then between 1892 and 1934, the landfill, it was expanded to 27.5 acres. So it grew from a really small island to a much larger island that we know today, this 27.5 acre island. And I just think that's fascinating. I did not know that.
And that you have, I mean, a lot of people flooding into this area. And you know, we have to understand, you know, why were they coming? And a lot of this has to do that these Southern and Eastern Europe individuals were feeling pulled to America. They had experienced poverty, religious persecution. There was famine. Of course, there's war. And people are also overcrowded. That's one of the things that you really see in Europe is that very little land opportunities, which meant you either had to work in the industry, you know, industrialization, which was taking off during this time. And people were struggling to find jobs. They were trying to make ends meet and they couldn't. And they kept hearing about the American dream. They kept hearing, you know, if you can get to America, there's a chance for you and for your family. And so these individuals, you know, would begin their journey on foot, horseback, on train. They would trek hundreds and hundreds of miles in Europe just to get to a seaport, to get to a place where there is a ship that's willing to take them over across the Atlantic Ocean into, what would eventually be Ellis Island, where they can make their journey. So Ray, just because they're coming to America doesn't mean that they're necessarily coming to the lights of New York or the success. They're coming to what you said, a landfill, basically. So I do agree with you. I think it's fascinating that all of the struggles that these individuals experience just to get to the boat, to get them to America, it doesn't just mean that as soon as they get off that boat that they're going to have all of their pain, all of their troubles taken away. Actually, as you mentioned, with discrimination and with some other things that are about to happen, their troubles are just beginning, just in a new location.
Yeah, and not everybody's going to be able to get through Ellis Island, and we'll talk about that. But one of the things you mentioned there was the ships that would bring people over from Europe to Ellis Island. And of course, many of these ships, they had different rankings of passengers. You had first class passengers, second class passengers, who were often kept in, I would guess you say, the type of conditions you would think about on a cruise, not a cruise ship, but a passenger ship at that time. But then you had, I guess you call third, fourth class passengers who were kept in steerage. And of course, this was sort of very deep in the ship, down in the hull of the ship, oftentimes open spaces. They're eating in large groups, they're living in large groups down below in steerage in this real poorly ventilated part of the ship. So for the people who were the poor, the people who were the less financially able, they had a more difficult journey than the people who were in first, second class. And not only that, when they arrived at Ellis Island, a lot of times the health inspectors would come on the ship. First and second class passengers, if you were deemed healthy, you went on through. But if you were coming from the steerage, you had a little bit more of a process you had to go through to get into the country. And I guess that's, Chris, where we want to go to. What happened when people went through Ellis Island, when people got off the boats and they walked, I can't remember if it was up or down the steps to get into the facility. What happened? I mean, what did they run into when they walked into the facility?
And to prepare that stage, it's important to remember that these are individuals from Europe. You have about 3,000 that would be on a ship at any particular given time. And so these individuals are coming from different countries with different languages, different religions, different experiences. So just trying to do that in itself is very tough. So when they get to Ellis Island, they are exactly what the Statue of Liberty in Scripture said: give me your tired, give me your poor, give me your huddled masses. That's how they felt. I mean, the ship would take about 2 weeks to get across seas. And, and so when they would finally see the Statue of Liberty, many of them were weeping with joy because they thought that their life was going to change. They thought that this was going to be that new beginning. And so, as you mentioned, when they arrived, before they even got off the ship, you would have health officials, as you mentioned, who would board the ship. And the first thing that they did is they looked for signs of disease. We also have this nativism that is going on in America during this time, which is that those who are already living in America are not necessarily happy with immigrants. Doesn't matter where they're coming from. They're just not happy with immigrants because immigrants are going to take their jobs. Immigrants are going to create overcrowding, hunger issues. So you have this nativist approach, which is saying, we don't really know if we like you coming. And so these health officials also trying to prevent the spread of disease. So they come on board. And if the ship passes inspection, if these health officials say, okay, everything's good, as you mentioned, we'll check first class, we'll check second class, they'll be processed pretty quickly, as you mentioned, and then we'll get to that third class. And when you got to the third class, I mean, they would be greeted by these officers, and these officers were not. They didn't offer 100% five-star customer service. I mean, they would basically shout. They would tell the people where to go. Now, remember, these Europeans didn't necessarily understand English as well. So they're being shouted at, they're being pushed, they're being told where to go. And the officers are passing out these identification tags that are basically saying, you're a 1, you're a 2, you're a 3. And so many people are just very confused and very anxious, and the commotion is extremely overwhelming. And as you see, you're carrying a trunk, with all your possessions. You've got clothes, you've got sacks, you've got suitcases, and you would enter. I think the first place that they entered was kind of like the baggage room, which is kind of like the main floor, the ground floor, if you will, where they would leave all of their belongings, right? Everything that they had struggled to labor to get across to America. The very first thing that they had to do was to leave it there. And then they went upstairs to kind of the grand entrance hall, if you will, which is where you will begin to have your medical inspection and your legal inspection. And Ray, at this point, things get really even more tenuous because we start to see the separation of families as they journey into these new steps, next locations.
Yeah. And, talking about the health inspections, you mentioned that, the customer service wasn't great here, but we have to remember that these inspectors, oftentimes they were dressed up more like police officers, I guess you would say, than actual doctors or nurses. And their job wasn't necessarily to care for the sick or anything like that. Their job was to protect, in their mind, to protect the United States from people bringing in diseases, maybe diseases such as influenza or any other disease, mental illness, cholera, tuberculosis, even. So when people are coming in, even before they reach a doctor or somebody, they're being watched. Are you coughing? Are you sneezing? Are you limping? Are you wheezing? They're being watched for any sign of illness.
And one of the other types of illnesses that we're looking for was this thing that was called trachoma, which was this contagious eye disease. And before you even necessarily get to the doctors, I guess you could say these are your security cards of the day. If you go through a security checkpoint, they're not really trained per se. I mean, they're trained to look for certain things, but they're not trained in the overall aspect. Well, these people would meet each one of these immigrants that were coming in, and they had this thing that was called a button hook. And what they did with the button hook is they would look and they would take it and they would peel back the eyelids of each individual, looking behind the eyeball, if you will, for any type of disease, especially the disease that was called trachoma, which was contagious. Ray, we're very sensitive to our eyes. We don't like people getting near our eyes. So imagine they've got this clothes hanger kind of thing that an untrained person speaking in a foreign language, and you don't know what is happening, but the thing that they're doing is they're approaching your eyes and they're looking at your eyes to see if there's disease. And if they saw anything, they would immediately pull you out of line and send you back on the ship. So the welcome to the United States is not very good at this particular moment. And that's before you even get to the medical exam, because what they just did, that's called like a 6-second physical, right? I mean, that was just a quick up and down. Are you good to go to the next stop? But then, Ray, when they actually got to the medical exam, things became even more intrusive.
Yeah, if anybody, there was something on the eye exam or they were seen coughing, they were often marked with blue chalk. And there were different marks for different suspected diseases and all that. Some of them would be sent to Ellis Island Hospital for observation. If it was a temporary thing, maybe just a cold, they could recover and then they could begin the process again. Others, as you mentioned, were put on a boat and sent right back where they came from, oftentimes at the expense of the ship. So the company that brought them over had to pay to send them back where they came from, which had to be devastating for someone who had struggled to get onto a ship, got all the way over here, and then for whatever reason, they're turned away, they're put back on a boat, and they're sent back to where they came from. And as you mentioned earlier, these people are not coming here because they just like the weather. They're coming here because there's that push and pull factor. They're being pulled by the hope of a new life, but they're being pushed by religious persecution, by famine, by poverty, by overcrowding. So they think they have escaped that, some of these people. And then when they get to America, some of them are turned away after going through a medical exam. And it wasn't just a medical exam either. They also put people through a test, a legal interview, where they would basically ask them questions. Years ago, you would go to the airport and they would ask you questions about your luggage or whatever. It's the same type of thing. And it would be a quick exam. But if your answers didn't match the answers on your paperwork, again, you could be turned away at that point. So there were a lot of points, whether it was the medical or whether it was the legal, there were a lot of points where a person could get turned away. And interestingly enough, Chris, I want to throw this out there, that between 1909 and 1911, 420 people, approximately 420 people, died in quarantine there on Ellis Island in the hospital. And it's interesting that 85% of those, according to one source, were under the age of 13. So a lot of these children coming into the Ellis Island who end up being quarantined, a lot of them died in quarantine.
Yeah, and I mean, for some of them, this was the island of hope, because they were going to have the opportunity to make a new living. But for those who were detained, those who were rejected, I mean, Ray, imagine you've spent all this money, you've gotten on board of a ship, you've endured so much suffering in 2-week travel on board of a ship with 3,000 other people. You get to a country, you don't understand the language, and somebody that you've never met before spends about 3 minutes talking to you, looking at you, and places an X on you and says that you are insane or you have a disability and therefore you're not welcome into the country. You can see how that becomes the island of tears all of a sudden. And I think it just goes to show, that this struggle with immigration that even exists today, that we want to be a country that welcomes all people, but yet we have all of these other things that are in place that doesn't necessarily welcome all people. And it is a struggle to try to understand, especially in 1892, where as soon as you pass the legal test and the medical test, you're actually led to a place that actually was called the Stairs of Separation, in which, one aisle sent people to the West, one aisle sent people to New York, and the other aisle basically sent people to the quarantine. And Ray, at this moment, you could have had a family of 6, grandma, grandpa, you got the kids, and you've got a husband and wife. And Ray, at that point, it was very possible that grandma gets sent back home on a ship, grandpa gets sent one other place, kids, with mom would usually always be together. But there was this potential that people would get displaced. And so, Ray, I can't imagine having endured all of that as a family. You've just left your belongings at a baggage room that you don't even know if you'll get that back. But at this point, after you pass medical and legal, there's the possibility that you get separated from your family. Once again, welcome to America. It's not the welcoming you would have expected.
And single women did not always find it easy as well, because there was a reluctance on the part of the authorities to allow single women to just sort of go into the country by themselves. So they oftentimes would have to wait until, of course, this is the late 19th, early 20th century. Women would have to have a man with them, whether it was a brother, a father, and even a husband. And some of the research I've learned that fiancés often married their wives right there on Ellis Island, to sort of get through as quick as they could, because you weren't, if you were a single woman, you weren't going to be let through without somebody there being responsible for you. And people, when they got, whether it was a medical detainment, a legal detainment, or just being held because they were a single woman or whatever, you could be detained for a few hours, a few days, or a few months. It wasn't always a very quick thing. And I want to sort of talk real quick about New York City, because you mentioned the Stairs of Separation. If I was there, I would probably want to go to the south or the west, because if you went to New York City, Manhattan, etc., wasn't exactly a good thing, because they had some of the very things, and you may have already mentioned this a little bit, some of the very things that these people were running from was there. Overcrowding being one of those things. Jobs are difficult to get. You've got the racism and the nativism that exists there. We haven't mentioned it. We've talked about the nativism, but also you have the anti-Catholic movement going on as well. And of course, a lot of these are Catholics. A good number of these people are Catholics. They're living in tenements, which are way overcrowded and unsanitary, just, places where disease spread easily. And the average life expectancy in that environment, Chris, was in early to mid 40s. So if these people went to New York City, they didn't exactly have an easy go of it. Life was going to be difficult. Disease, overcrowding, all of that kind of stuff, nativism, discrimination, when they arrived in where they were going.
Yeah, and it is important to point out a couple of things that you saw. Basically, numbers suggest between 5,000 to 10,000 people would pass through the checkpoints of Ellis Island daily, and about 80% passed. So I don't want our listeners to think, well, there was more rejected than there were passed. I mean, about 80% successfully passed. And what's interesting is that the last station of Ellis Island was a place that was known as the Kissing Post. And what we have to remember is that these families that were coming to America, most of them already had individuals who were already here. They had already made the trek. They had made the journey, and, or they had already been in this place, and once again, people leaving Europe had somewhere to go to escape all of the things that we've already mentioned. And so this was the point where, for the first time, the families or the individuals finally met someone that they knew. They finally found that person that spoke their language, hugged them, embraced them, kissed them, and truly rolled out the red carpet and said, "Welcome home." So once you made it, off the ship, through the different locations, and you would get to that point, the whole area that we had, I think that's where we have this idea of, I've made it and I'm satisfied and I'm ready to welcome into this. But as you mentioned, your journey just began, because some went west, and that's a whole nother trip. Some went south, and some remained in New York, and the issues that were going to happen there were something else. And Ray, I just think it's interesting that we also go and think through about these people that did come over. Some of them came with families, some of them were single, as you mentioned. But Ray, there were a lot of unaccompanied minors that traveled over here also. And actually, there's some research to suggest that the first immigrants who actually arrived were 3 unaccompanied minors. So there's just so much going on here. I just can't even imagine what it must have been like getting into America.
And the desperation that must have pushed these people to go through that. I mean, if nothing else, just the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. But then all the other stuff they would have to face, the uncertainty when they arrived. Were they going to be one of the 80% that made it through, or were they going to be one of the 20%? And like we've said over and over again here, even when you were one of the 80% that made it through, that didn't mean life was a bowl of cherries. There was still going to be challenges ahead.
Yeah, and we have to think back. Like, I remember there's individuals who have been mentioned. I think like New Year's Day, 1892. I think it was the steamship that was known as Nevada arrived. I think it had 124 passengers. And history shows us that the first would-be immigrant to set foot on the island was actually a teenager from Ireland, whose name was Annie Orr. She's one of those 3 unaccompanied minors that I mentioned. And she had actually crossed over with her 11 and 7-year-old brothers for the whole purpose of reuniting with other family that had already come in New York. And there's actually a statue today that is kept on display at the Ellis Island Museum of those 3 children and the struggle that they went. Ray, I know that you always have some stories that kind of go into the supernatural, if you will. Maybe they talk about the ghost of immigrant past. Anything about Ellis Island that might speak to ghost or some kind of weird occurrences, because it's no longer a station anymore. It's a museum. People can go and they can view the museum. but there's still it's still a really cool place to visit, and probably people have experienced I guess some strange things happening there.
Yeah, I mean, you think about one of the largest public health facilities in the United States at the time. You think about the trials and tribulations of the people coming through the island and the building there. So yeah, there certainly are stories of ghosts, and I think of most of the locations we've talked about when we've been looking at this series of important historical locations throughout the United States. Most of them have had some degree of ghost stories. And of course, Ellis Island is no exception to that. One thing that's often reported in the Great Hall, which is that place where, people are put in for their medical exam, their legal exam, is some have reported hearing children laughing in the hall. Others have reported just voices, children's voices specifically. There's been reports, of course, of doors opening and closing by themselves and muffled crying that people hear throughout the facility as they are visiting there. And of course, that makes you wonder why anybody would be there by themselves at night. I certainly wouldn't. Others, of course, have heard your typical furniture moving around, and just like motion and commotion around the building, and then they go in there and it's empty. There's nobody there. So I think it's certainly a place of important history in the United States. It's certainly a place where people's dreams were made or sometimes crushed as they tried to escape their old life and start a new one. Well, Chris, this has been a great episode, I think, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed this episode, I hope you will share it with your family and friends. Look us up on Facebook, on Twitter. We can be heard on iHeart, Spotify, Sounder FM, Google, and basically wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question or comment, you can always leave it for us there on Twitter or Facebook, or you can email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. So until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.